Risk is one of the most popular board games of all time. It has cemented itself in the public consciousness as one of the defining examples of what a board game is, along with the rest of the Hasbro catalog. For anyone who hasn't played Risk, it is a simple strategy game. Players spend the game fighting for control of a world map. The entire game focuses on the combat, and any other mechanics revolving around economics, research, or technology, or anything else that would distract from the core gameplay, is absent. This is the formula that Risk presented. However, it is important to realize that Risk is a very old game, first released in 1957. Just like other fields, the field of board game design has evolved a lot since then. Since its release, many games have come out that offer the players the exact same experience, but in a much more refined way. One of these games is Small World. Released in 2009 by Days of Wonder, Small World has taken the Risk formula and has applied modern design philosophies, and in turn fixed many of the problems that Risk had, because, spoiler alert, Risk has a lot of problems. Today we're going to compare the design of these two games and see how Small World has taken Risk and presented a version of its formula in a way that fixed every major problem that Risk has. Before we look into Small World, I want to talk about the major problems that Risk has before talking about how Small World fixes them. There are 5 main problems that Risk has. There is poorly designed randomness, it is too long, it has poorly designed player elimination, it suffers from a dominant strategy, and it has a problem with a runaway leader. Let's look at these closer to see what I'm talking about. The problem of poorly designed randomness is probably the largest problem holding the game back. As I talked about in my video on Armello's randomness, randomness is okay, as long as the player has ways to mitigate the randomness and tilt the odds in their favor. Applying this to Risk, we find that the randomness gives players very little room to affect the outcome of the battle. There is really only one way you can improve your odds in Risk, and that is simply by throwing more men into a battle. There are a couple of problems with this, though. Even though throwing more men into the battle does technically improve your odds, it doesn't actually affect the dice rolls themselves, which boil down to a simple competition of who can roll higher. The number of dice you roll is based on the number of units you have, to a point. The attacker cannot have more than 3 dice, and the defender cannot have more than 2. Aside from this, the outcome of the battle is purely in the hands of the dice. The only advantage to having more units is being able to roll the dice more. This also feeds into some of the other problems in the game. Since throwing more units into battle is the only way to improve your odds, the players who have the most units will have an easier time winning battles. I'll talk about this more in a later part of the video, but just for now, know that this will lead to a case where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, because people who are behind don't have units to spare to ensure that they win a dice battle. There is a general rule in game design that the more random your game is, the shorter it should be. Games like Bang the Dice game show that you can still have a very random game, but if it is a very short game, it feels a lot better. Because games of Bang only take about 15 minutes to play, it doesn't matter that the dice screwed you over this game, because perhaps they'll be in your favor for the next game. On the other end of the spectrum, there are lengthy strategy games like Twilight Imperium 3rd Edition that can last for 5 or 7 hours. People still like Twilight Imperium 3rd Edition because players have a lot of control over the outcome of the game, and it offers a wider array of tactical options. Risk doesn't work as a 5 or 6 hour game because, as I said earlier, the players have little control over the events of the game. The players' actions begin to feel arbitrary and of no consequence if the game has uncontrollable randomness, which isn't a problem for short party games, but when you're spending several hours of your life playing this game, you want to have as much influence over the outcome of the game as possible. Players who play well want to be rewarded for playing well, and Risk doesn't do this. Risk also handles player elimination very poorly. In Risk, it is the player's goal to eliminate all the other players, which is not inherently a problem. Many games have player elimination that feels quite fair, such as the aforementioned Bang the Dice game. Player elimination is a lot like randomness. The shorter a game is, the more acceptable player elimination is. The problem with player elimination is that it is entirely possible for a player to be eliminated in the first hour or two of a game, and then they will have to sit and watch the game for a couple hours. Being eliminated early on in a game, and then having to watch your friends play for a couple hours, isn't a whole lot of fun, even if it was completely your fault. So it is generally best if designers avoid using player elimination for longer games. Think back to the last time you played Risk. What was the most important and fought-over continent in the game? Chances are that continent was Australia. While it isn't absolutely essential to win, it is easily defendable, making it very strong if you can take it over. A dominant strategy is a strategy that overshadows all other strategies and becomes the dominant focus of the game. If a strategy is too powerful, it removes a lot of decision-making from the game. If players have a choice between two evenly balanced strategies, they need to weigh every factor to determine which will be more powerful for them in the long run. But if one strategy is too strong, the choice becomes obvious, and the interesting strategic decision is lost. Australia has become a dominant strategy in Risk, and oftentimes the outcome of the game relies heavily on what happens down under. The other continents are much harder to hold than Australia, so many players will center their entire strategy around this one continent for its steady 2-unit boost, which, as I said before, is the only way to affect the outcome of a battle. The 2 units per turn it provides might not seem like a lot, but again, the units are the only way to improve your odds, and having these 2 extra units per turn, compared to a player that doesn't have those 2 extra units, will lead to a greater chance of victory in the long run. Finally, Risk suffers from a runaway leader. The number of units you receive in Risk is based on how much land you control, so once you start gaining more land than the other players, you will receive more units than the other players, which allows you to take more land than the other players, which gives you more units, and so forth. It is also important to note that this is true in reverse. If you lose land, you receive less units, which means that you will have a harder time defending your land that you still have, which means that you will receive less units when people start taking your land, and so on. This is not fun for a couple of reasons. Firstly, losing players feel as if there's nothing they can do to change the outcome of the game and fight back, which again makes their decisions feel arbitrary, because they're going to lose anyway. It also isn't much fun for the player in the lead, because the game loses a lot of its tension. No one is on the edge of their seat, biting their nails, wondering who's going to win, because everyone knows that it is probably going to be the player who is receiving the most units, and that player is the person that's already in the lead. These are the main problems with Risk, and a lot of them are closely linked and feed into each other, making them even worse. Now let's turn our focus to Small World to see how it fixes these problems with Risk, with only some minor changes to the Risk formula. For anyone who has never played Small World before, here's a brief summary of the game. Players control a group of fantasy races fighting for control of a world map. One of the most unique features of Small World are the races. Each game, each race is given a random attribute, which gives them a special ability, on top of the special ability that the race starts with. One game you could have the Flying Orcs and the Diplomatic Ratmen, and the next game you could have the Diplomatic Ratmen and the Flying Orcs. When you select a race, you receive a certain number of tokens based on what race you chose. The combat is very simple. To take over an empty space, you must spend 2 tokens, and you must spend 1 additional token for every token already on that space. At the end of a player's turn, they get 1 gold for every territory they control. Since the players never get any new units, eventually the players will be spread thin, and their ability to take over new land will slow down. At this point, the player can put their race into decline. They lose all their special abilities, but they still control the territories of their races in decline. And next turn, they can choose a fresh new race to invade the board with. After a predetermined number of rounds, the player with the most gold wins. Now let's talk about how this fixes every problem that Risk has. Let's start by talking about randomness, since it is probably the largest difference between Small World and Risk. Players know the outcome of a battle before it even takes place in Small World. While deterministic combat isn't necessarily better than combat with random elements, it does make tactical planning a lot easier. In Small World, you know exactly how your turn is going to end, with one minor exception. At the end of your turn, if you still have units left over, you can attack a territory even though you don't have enough units to take it over. When you do this, you get to roll the reinforcement dice. Just like Armello, the reinforcement dice does not have a typical dice pattern. 3 of the faces are empty, and the other 3 have 1, 2, and 3 pips. Even if you do manage to take over a territory, this kind of randomness will only ever give you 1 additional gold per turn, and it plays a far lesser role in determining the victor than the dice in Risk. Since Small World uses deterministic combat, it becomes much more tactical and avoids some of the pitfalls in games with poorly designed randomness. There are still some disadvantages to deterministic combat, which I talk about more in my video on Armello. Small World does get around some of these disadvantages through some clever design. In my video on Armello, I mentioned that players often memorize ideal opening moves and employ them in almost every game. This is not possible in Small World, since their races will be randomly generated every game, and their order will also be randomly generated, meaning that 2 games will have very different openings, meaning that players cannot rely solely on memorizing turns because the best options will change every game. Overall, Small World uses its deterministic combat much more effectively than Risk uses its random combat. And that is why Small World's combat is much better than Risk's. Small World is also a lot shorter than Risk. Instead of dragging on until every player is wiped out, Small World only lasts a set number of rounds based on the number of players. The game only lasts about an hour or so, which is a good length for a light strategy game. It is much easier to get a group of players to sit down for a 1-hour game of Small World as opposed to Risk, which could take several hours and might not be feasible for everyone to play. Small World achieves the length that the developers felt was best by changing the victory and endgame conditions. Everyone has the same amount of time to get the most points possible, and nothing in the game is going to change the amount of time that the players have. This gives the developers of the game a lot of control when it comes to game length, since nothing can change the length of the game, allowing the developers to fairly accurately predict how long a game is going to be, and furthermore, allowing them to select a game length that fits the style of game that they are trying to design. Small World takes a note from German-style Euro games and decides to get rid of player elimination. Even if other players gang up to wipe you off the map, you aren't eliminated from the game. When one race falls, you will just begin the cycle again with a brand new race of fresh blood. Small World is not the longest board game. However, it is long enough that if it included player elimination, players unlucky enough to get eliminated early in the game would have to wait around a decent amount of time before the game is finished. Deciding to ditch player elimination helps keep all of the players engaged throughout the entire game, which is just more fun for everyone involved. Small World also avoided the dominant strategy problem. The map of Small World is split up into many territories. However, every territory has the same value, and it doesn't have continents that inflate the value of certain territories over others. Because Small World doesn't have a dominant strategy, it allows for a wide array of strategies to exist within the game, which goes a long way to add variety to the game and increase replayability. Small World also retains its strategic depth, since the choice of what strategy to use is not always obvious, and will change from game to game because of the randomly generated races. and because no one strategy is better than any other. Even though Small World uses mostly deterministic combat, it has much less of a problem with a runaway leader than other deterministic games because of the decline system. With 2 exceptions, it is impossible to gain any more units for your race, and that means that as your race takes over more territory, they will have less units to defend the territory and less units available to attack on the next turn. Even if you come out swinging at the start of the game and take over a lot of territory very quickly, that only makes it easier for other players to take you down, since your race will be more spread out. 8 units over 4 territories is a lot easier to defend than 8 units over 8 territories. Once you feel that it is no longer worth it to keep your current race, you can put them into decline. This does have a couple of serious drawbacks. Once you put a race into decline, you cannot do anything else that turn. You lose your special ability, and you go down to 1 unit for every space. This gives everyone else an opportunity to invade your territory, and prevents any player from becoming too powerful. This in turn helps keep the game really close, and helps to build suspense and tension, certainly more so than Risk, where you can tell who is going to win long before the game is finally over. Over the course of this video, I have shown you the design of 2 games that present the same general idea, but the devil is in the details, and slight differences in how these 2 games execute the same formula radically change the experience these 2 games deliver. Hopefully, comparing the design of these 2 games has helped illustrate some of the pitfalls that Risk fell into and how they can be avoided. If you've never played Small World before, I would highly recommend checking it out. It is not super complicated, which makes it a great introduction into the world of tabletop games, but it still offers a lot of depth and replayability. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. This has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.